Banned and silenced, how did Pete Seeger rise again to inspire millions? What I'm about to tell you about Pete Seeger was never meant to be public. The government files, the secret recordings, the backroom deals that destroyed careers, all of it was supposed to stay buried forever. But today, the truth finally comes out. Between you and me, the Pete Seeger you thought you knew. That's just the surface-level story they've allowed to be told. My industry source, a former federal agent who worked directly on Seeger's case, has revealed documents that will change everything you thought you knew about one of America's most beloved folk singers. The motivation behind his persecution wasn't just about politics. It was personal. And what the tabloids don't know is that the same powerful forces that tried to silence Seeger are still operating today. Before we dive deeper, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear might shake your faith in American institutions. The blacklisting era wasn't just some regrettable footnote in history. It was a calculated campaign that continues to influence our world in ways they don't want you to understand. Pete Seeger stood before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1955, but what happened in that room was far more sinister than the history books tell us. According to my source, Seeger wasn't just another name on their list, he was their primary target. Why? Because his music had the power to move people in ways that terrified those in power. The committee members had a secret dossier on Seeger that tracked his every move for years. They didn't just want to silence him, they wanted to make an example of him. Between you and me, the transcripts that were released to the public were heavily edited. What Seeger actually said that day was far more damning to the committee than anyone has ever known. But that's nothing compared to what happened next. After refusing to name names, Seeger wasn't just blacklisted, he was systematically erased. My source revealed that there was an actual playbook for destroying careers like Seeger's. Television producers received direct calls from government officials threatening to pull their station licenses if they featured him. Record companies were pressured to destroy master recordings. Concert venues were intimidated into canceling shows with just hours' notice. The most shocking part: the FBI had a dedicated team of agents whose sole purpose was monitoring Seeger's impact on young Americans. They believed, and I'm quoting directly from a classified memo here, that Seeger's musical influence represents a clear and present danger to American youth's loyalty to democratic principles. They don't want this getting out, but Seeger was actually offered a deal that would have ended his blacklisting immediately. All he had to do was record a few patriotic songs with lyrics that had been written by government-approved writers. My source showed me the actual proposed lyrics, and let me tell you, they read like propaganda that would make even the most hardened Cold Warrior cringe. Seeger's response: he didn't just refuse, he wrote a scathing letter that has been kept from the public for over 6 decades. In it, he predicted exactly how the government's campaign against artists would eventually backfire. The letter was so prophetic that my source says it's still used in internal FBI training as an example of adversarial insight. During the height of the blacklist, Seeger lost nearly everything. What the history books don't tell you is that his family was also targeted. His children were followed to school. His wife was denied employment. Between you and me, there were even plans to plant evidence in his home that would have led to serious criminal charges. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While banned from television and major concert halls, Seeger made a decision that would ultimately save not just his career, but his soul. My industry source revealed to me that Seeger created an underground network of folk musicians who shared songs and performed in secret venues across the country. This folk underground became the backbone of what would later emerge as the 1960s counterculture movement. The government knew about these gatherings, but couldn't stop them without revealing the extent of their surveillance operations. According to classified documents, they actually considered raiding several concerts but feared creating martyrs. One internal memo stated, "Seeger's influence grows stronger in the shadows. Public confrontation only amplifies his message, but that's just the beginning of what they've been hiding." In 1961, something happened that changed everything for Seeger, though few people know the real story. A young producer at a small television station decided to risk everything by featuring Seeger on a local program. Within hours, federal agents were at the station demanding the tapes. But what they didn't know was that the producer had already made copies and distributed them to trusted colleagues across the country. These underground recordings became some of the most sought-after items in folk music circles. My source tells me that college students would hold secret listening parties, and the more the government tried to suppress these recordings, the more valuable they became. It was the first major crack in the Blacklist's foundation. Between you and me, there were powerful people in Washington who wanted to make an example of this producer. But something unexpected happened. 3 senators, whose names have been redacted from all official documents, secretly intervened. Why? Because they had been quietly supporting Seeger's work for years, while publicly condemning him. The hypocrisy went all the way to the top. The motivation behind these senators' support wasn't entirely pure. They had recognized that the anti-communist fervor was beginning to wane, and they wanted to be on the right side of history when the pendulum inevitably swung back. My source showed me private correspondence that reveals their calculated political maneuvering. But the most shocking revelation about Seeger's blacklisting period is something that has never been reported anywhere. During the darkest years of his career, Seeger was secretly invited to perform at diplomatic functions in other countries. The same government that publicly condemned him was privately using his talent to improve America's image abroad. These performances were classified at the highest levels, with only a handful of State Department officials knowing the truth. Can you imagine the cognitive dissonance? Being labeled a threat to American values at home, while being used as an ambassador for those same values overseas. My industry contact revealed that Seeger kept a journal during this period that contains details so explosive that his family has kept it locked away. They fear what might happen if the full extent of the government's hypocrisy was exposed. The truth is, Pete Seeger's resilience wasn't just about personal courage, though he had that in spades. What they don't want you to know is that his persistence exposed fractures within the very system that was trying to silence him. Different government agencies were working at cross purposes, with the State Department sometimes undermining the FBI's efforts. By 1967, as the blacklist was finally weakening, Seeger was invited to perform on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, his first national television appearance in 17 years. But what the history books don't tell you is that CBS executives received an anonymous package just days before the broadcast. Inside was evidence that would have destroyed the careers of several network executives if they went through with Seeger's appearance. They aired the segment anyway, minus Seeger's controversial anti-war song, waist deep in the Big Muddy. But the behind-the-scenes drama was far more intense than anyone has ever revealed. My source tells me that Tom and Dick Smothers risked everything to get Seeger on their show, and the fallout contributed to their program, eventually being canceled despite top ratings. Between you and me, the real reason CBS finally allowed Seeger back on television had little to do with artistic freedom and everything to do with changing demographics. Internal market research had shown that banning folk musicians was costing them the crucial youth audience. It wasn't principle, it was profit. The aftermath of Seeger's blacklisting contains lessons that are more relevant today than ever before. My source revealed that government agencies conducted extensive studies on why their efforts to silence Seeger ultimately failed. Their conclusions: his authenticity made him impossible to truly cancel. When you stand firmly in your truth, even the most powerful forces eventually have to bend. What the tabloids don't know is that Seeger's FBI file remained active until the early 1990s, decades after most people assumed the surveillance had ended. Agents were still monitoring his anti-nuclear activism, his environmental work, and especially his relationships with international artists who had their own political controversies. The motivation behind this extended surveillance wasn't just bureaucratic inertia. According to my source, certain officials had staked their careers on proving Seeger was dangerous, and they couldn't admit they were wrong. Even as he was being awarded the National Medal of Arts in 1994, there were still efforts to collect intelligence on him. Between you and me, the government's own analysis eventually concluded that blacklisting Seeger had been one of their greatest strategic errors. Instead of silencing him, they had created a legend. Instead of containing his message, they had amplified it. An internal report, which has never been declassified, actually credits the blacklisting with making Seeger more influential than he would have been otherwise. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. In the early 2000s, as Seeger entered his 80s, something extraordinary happened that has been kept from the public until now. My industry source revealed to me that several former government officials who had been involved in Seeger's blacklisting reached out to him privately to apologize. These weren't low-level operatives. These were men who had held positions at the highest levels of power. One former official, whose name I've been asked to withhold, wrote Seeger a letter that said, "We thought we were protecting America, but we were diminishing it. Your courage taught me more about patriotism than all my years in government service." Seeger kept these communications private, not out of respect for these men, but because he understood something profound about reconciliation. The truth finally exposed is that Pete Seeger's greatest victory wasn't just surviving the blacklist. It was changing the hearts and minds of the very people who had tried to destroy him. By the end of his life, he had outlived most of his persecutors, and history had vindicated him so completely that even his former enemies couldn't deny his moral authority. Now that you know the truth about Pete Seeger's battle against the blacklist, here's what happens next. The question we have to ask ourselves is, who are today's Pete Seegers? What voices are being silenced right now because they challenge power? My source, who has worked within the highest levels of government, tells me that the methods have changed, but the motivation to control narrative remains exactly the same. Between you and me, there are still blacklists operating today. They just don't call them that anymore. The techniques have become more sophisticated, more digital, more deniable. But somewhere right now, There's an artist being told to change their message or face the consequences. What Seeger's story teaches us is that resilience isn't just about personal survival. It's about preserving truth for future generations. When he sang "We Shall Overcome," he wasn't just offering hope, he was making a prediction. And he was right. The most powerful revelation from my research into Seeger's blacklisting period is that courage is contagious. One person's refusal to be silenced inspires others to find their voice. By the time the folk revival of the 1960s was in full swing, countless musicians cited Seeger as their inspiration, not just musically, but morally. But here's the thing they don't want you to realize about Pete Seeger's legacy. His fight never really ended. The forces that tried to silence him have simply found new targets and new methods. My source tells me that government agencies have studied the blacklist era extensively to learn how to make modern censorship more effective and less visible. Between you and me, the real reason Seeger's story isn't taught more widely in schools isn't oversight, it's by design. His example of principled resistance to authority represents a direct challenge to conformity. When students learn how one person with a banjo stood up to the full force of government intimidation and won, it plants dangerous ideas about individual conscience versus institutional power. The motivation behind keeping these stories in the shadows is simple. Inspired people are harder to control. Seeger understood this, which is why he spent his later years teaching children, seeding the next generation with the courage to stand up for what's right. What the tabloids don't know is that there are thousands of pages of still classified documents about Seeger and other blacklisted artists that agencies refuse to release even decades later. My industry source has seen some of these documents and says they reveal a level of government overreach that would shock even the most cynical observer. But here's the most important question of all. What would Pete Seeger do today? In a world where cancel culture, corporate influence, and government surveillance have created new forms of silencing, how would he respond? Based on everything my source has revealed about his character and conviction, I believe he would do exactly what he did before: sing the truth, no matter the consequences. And that's the real legacy of Pete Seeger's fight against blacklisting. Not just that he survived it, but that he showed us all a path forward. When faced with forces that seem overwhelming, he picked up his banjo and found another way to be heard. Between you and me, there's one final secret about Pete Seeger that almost nobody knows. In the last years of his life, he was working on a project to identify and support artists who were being silenced in various countries around the world. This work continues today through individuals who were inspired by his example. The truth about resilience is that it isn't just about bouncing back. It's about moving forward with purpose. Seeger didn't just reclaim his career. He transformed it into something more meaningful than it would have been without the challenge of the blacklist. So what happens now? Now that you know what they've been hiding about one of America's most beloved folk singers, you have a choice to make. Will you let this story end here, or will you become part of keeping Seeger's legacy of principled resistance alive? Because here's what they really don't want you to know. The same courage that helped Pete Seeger overcome the blacklist exists in each of us. The same power to stand in your truth despite enormous pressure to compromise. The same ability to find your voice even when powerful forces try to silence it. Between you and me, I've only scratched the surface of the Pete Seeger files. There are connections to current events that would make your head spin, patterns that repeat themselves throughout history, whenever truth-tellers challenge power. And in our next video, I'll reveal how Seeger's methods for overcoming censorship are being used by artists today who face similar challenges. If this story of resilience against all odds resonated with you, hit subscribe now. Because in 2 weeks, I'll be sharing the contents of a recently declassified file that connects Seeger's case directly to modern whistleblowers, and the parallels are uncanny. The motivation behind my research into these hidden histories is simple. We can't prepare for the future if we don't understand the past. And between you and me, the lessons from Pete Seeger's fight against the blacklist have never been more relevant than they are right now. The truth has finally been exposed. What will you do with it? Estimated duration, 10.8 minutes.